BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
I grew up with all kinds of negative images and portrayals of what being poor or working class in America meant. And so Bronx River Sankofa is about actually simply looking at who African Americans were, what they did, what some of their ideas were, so that they begin to speak for themselves. I think this is a necessary corrective for a lot of us who have had our minds polluted by ideas that never should have been on the airwaves to begin with. So this is a very active process of reclaiming African American history for the people who've actually lived it, including those who are no longer here to tell their stories by looking at various documents, records, monuments that they have left, again, over the last 350 plus years, because African Americans first made an impact in a way that is recorded within the Bronx, because as early as the 1620s, during the Dutch colonial period, African Americans, being the first municipal labor force for the colony, cleared land beyond Manhattan Island in places like Brooklyn and the Bronx. Now, we don't know for sure whether or not the land that was cleared eventually became the land that was granted to and owned by Jonas Bronx, the first Western settler, but it very well may have been. What we do know is that by the very end of the 1660s, early 1670s, the manor of Morrisania, which originally extended to the Bronx River, became for a very long time the population in the Bronx where African Americans were the most dominant. So that even though during slavery, a typical white person who held a slave claimed no more than two, in Morrisania, the ratios between black and white were very different. So it was mostly Africans, with just a handful of white people. So with that, we're going to look at the first site on this tour, which is the Lorraine Hansberry School, right over there. That building was built in the early 1970s and commemorates Lorraine Hansberry, who is a noted author from the mid-century, and more than an author, she was also an activist. Many members of her family were charter members of the Congress of Racial Equality, and she herself, even though she did not live in the Bronx, when she moved to the Northeast, she lived in Manhattan, and then she bought a house on the Hudson River with her husband. She donated many purses of money to civil rights causes and was very active herself, negotiating for protection for civil rights workers in the South with the Attorney General, Kennedy, and others. So she's somebody who really deserves to be known. And I'm going to show you a document from her creative production, if you just hold that side, please. That's worth being aware of. So this is a book which she contributed the text to, and so it's an account of the civil rights movement as it was happening. This book was published around 1964, and she contributed the words to it. Looks almost like a vision from Occupy Wall Street to me. So we want to acknowledge Lorraine Hansberry not just as an artist, but also as an activist and someone who had a very clear vision of the long-term contribution that people of African ancestry have made to this country. We also want to acknowledge Sean Puffy Combs, who grew up in another Bronx River community, Mount Vernon, and went to a school in Wakefield, which also, which is also within the Bronx River watershed. So there you have it. He was executive producer less than 4 years ago of Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, which you can all get on DVD. There's so many layers of history. So we are now looking at a photocopy of a hip-hop flyer for an early jam that happened in the Lorraine Hansberry School. I realize that all of you can see these images as I project them, but I am going to plop my behind down at the end of the tour on 174th Street, Longfellow Avenue, and any documents you have not seen, feel free to examine at that point. Many of you should have or do have, you certainly can get from Misha in the back, a guide to today's tour. And that guide will help you follow the tour. We're going to physically go to locations and vicinities where significant people, places, and events have happened in the life of this community since the 1600s. Because I cannot answer most questions you might have during the tour because of its length and because some of you have things to do after 1 o'clock, again, I will sit down in E.J. Mitchell Park, where this park ends, and answer every question I have the capacity to. And any questions I cannot answer, I will answer by email or Facebook. And you all know how to reach me because the guide for today's talk beneath the map includes my contact information. So all of you now have my email address, the Facebook page for this work, and even my mailing address for old school people who prefer to communicate by letters. Yes, I will write you a letter back. I am not running away from anybody. I am not ignoring anybody. I am accountable to every question you might possibly have about this research. So now you know how to reach me for further clarification. As we look over at the Lorraine Hansberry School, please come in. Many of you will notice there is a red sculpture in front of the building. That sculpture was created by Todd Williams from Savannah, Georgia, who was a sculptor and painter who is still represented by a New York City gallery, Peg Alston Gallery on Central Park West. Yes, she's a sister. And he went to the School of Visual Arts and City College of the City University of New York. He also was part of the first show ever to exhibit African American art at the Whitney Museum of American Art back in 1971. So he's somebody who's worth knowing. And he's someone who ought to have a plaque by his sculpture denoting who he is. Tragically, one of the things this tour will explore, expose, is that even though people of African ancestry have been a dominant ethnic group in the Bronx for a ridiculously long period of time, there is actually almost no signage of most things we've ever done. So here we are, living and walking streets named for populations that have not lived in the Bronx in significant numbers in over 80 years. And meanwhile, our public schools, our streets, other places that are public are mostly not named for this population. So again, I am very actively advocating that there be better signage. Yes, there needs to be a plaque saying that that is Lollipop Sculpture by Todd Williams. Yes, there needs to be a historical plaque at Joseph Rodman Drake Park in Hunts Point denoting that even though you have the Wasp Cemetery there with founding white families like the Hunts and the Leggetts, you need to know that across the street there was an African burial ground. The Bronx has at least 2 completely unsigned African burial grounds, and they're in public parks, so there's no good reason why a modest effort could not get historical signage there. These are spaces that you own. City government is accountable to you. You have the right to demand that among the other narrative of public spaces, there also be recognition of these spaces. So with that, let's walk along East Tremont Avenue to our first site. Okay, so I just encourage everybody, if you just form a kind of semicircle, I'd appreciate it. So as I said, this work is very actively about reclaiming African American history. And one of the ways we do that is we know that whoever controls the story of a people helps to affect how they are treated, how they are seen, what remains of their heritage. And so many generations, including the lady who is getting out of the beautiful vehicle right there, Mrs. Cecilia Woolery, and others who lived at Lambert houses, which we will see very soon, and other places, have done restoration work on the Bronx River for well over 3 decades. And that work deserves to be documented, which is why I am the author of the historical plaque for this park, which will be unveiled as an official form sometime in the next 9 months. So may I have 2 assistants to put this plaque up. So you are standing outside of what will be called West Farms Rapids, was originally the Bronx River Restoration Project Incorporated mini park, and then was named Restoration Park by a local youth who won a naming contest. I want to encourage everybody who's on this tour who cares about history, hold on to your history and make sure that the way that you are recorded is accurate. Because when that ball is dropped, other things happen. Sometimes it's not a bad thing, sometimes it is. So this park was renamed, not maliciously, but because the history was not retained. And so it's going to reopen as West Farms Rapids Park. But had there been a stronger historical movement, it would have been retained as Restoration Park. So the accommodation is we will accept the new name, but we're going to make sure we have an accurate history. Let's go. Okay, so let's put those back. So we're standing here recognizing many, many years of African American accomplishment, contribution to the Bronx River, and intellectual production. I'm holding an image from the president of Bronx Community College at the time in 1973 and 74, where they assumed the former New York University Uptown campus. So those of you who go to Bronx Community College at any point may wonder, this is a really beautiful campus of buildings, how did it get here? If you didn't know, now you do. That was NYU's Uptown campus, never the Bronx campus. It was the University Heights campus or Uptown campus. I'm not saying I agree with that, I'm just being accurate about how they represented it. So this gentleman, who was the 2nd president of Bethune-Cookman University, had these words to say about the power of history. Dr. James A. Colston said in 1974 to an address to his students, quote, "If there is any lesson to be drawn from our unique experience, it could be that a consciousness of one's past is the only reference point for determining the future. A life motivated in escaping the past, no matter how humble, will abort any real sense of purpose. We release ourselves from the enslavement of escapism by recognizing the essential connection between past, present, and future." Thank you, Brother Colston. We're standing here to recognize, and she's being very sheepish in the back, but we're very fortunate to have Miss Ruth Anderberg, who started the Bronx River Restoration Project in 1974. Thank you, Miss Anderberg. Do you want to say anything? Okay, I know. Yeah, Miss Anderberg's very shy. And, but I did want to acknowledge Miss Anderberg. So, many people walk by this bridge over the Bronx River every day and may not consciously appreciate that one of the earliest things that Bronx River Restoration Project did was help to stabilize the banks of the Bronx River here in West Farms with the rock and soil-stuffed tires that you see in the Bronx River. Were you part of that? Yes. Okay. Many accomplishments of that earlier effort, Bronx River Restoration Project Incorporated, can be seen right here in West Farms. So the banks are being stabilized by these tires that were installed here between about 1978 and 1981. But there's also the building that's right here. So this is an industrial building that's been here for over 100 years. It's been many things over time. It's been a bank. It's been a clothing factory. It's been a place where paint materials were stored. It's been an electronics shop. It's been many, 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 many things. And Bronx River Restoration had a vision of it being multiple purposes that would help reinforce the Bronx River, create a sense of community and agency, including a Bronx River Arts Center, which it now is, and also for it to be administrative offices for Bronx River Restoration, which it was for a brief time, so that there are galleries on the base level, offices on the top, artist studios in between. As we look across the street, we see what is now a carefully maintained park that is now Drew Gardens rather. However, the original vision was for it to be an outdoor theater. So some visions of the Bronx River Restoration Project have modified over time. We also want to acknowledge that if we could see through the trees here on the Bronx River, on the east bank of the river, we would see just about 2 blocks away something called River Garden, which is a community garden. So you have all these wonderful ways to rehabilitate the river and the people, because the two are intimately related, and that all came out of the vision of Bronx River Restoration. So one more hand for Bronx River Restoration, founded in 1974. Okay, some of you are going to like this part. So for anyone who needs a restroom, there is a park 2 blocks away, and that will be our first bathroom break. It's called River Park at 180th Street and Boston Road. Let's go. Good seeing you both. You get a guide? Excellent. Excellent. A lot of things have happened in museum culture in the last 10 years that among academics are widely known, but the general public, it's not making the papers. And so, believe it or not, there have been many major museum expansions planned in America that have been stopped in the last 10 years. And they've been stopped largely because the sense of the communities was that museums in many ways have gotten away from some of their core original 19th century functions of a focus on educating the public. Even among elite audiences, like the people who live around the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that expansion, the way they wanted to do it, was stopped cold, because even for some of those very upper income local people, they felt like it was a celebration of the museum and it was not enough about pursuing the core mission. But other things have happened in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Major museums have not been allowed to expand because there's been such mission drift. And so part of what I've gotten out of reading some of the essays from, again, this underground movement that most people don't even know about, is we need to be more conscious, those of us who work in culture, of what we put in the frame, What do we validate? What is important? What do we say is important? Okay, and so I am very actively saying in this tour that working class history is worth knowing, is worth documenting, is worth validating, that it deserves to be on the page. One of the things that's come to me in my research is, of all the histories written about the Bronx, I don't just mean neighborhood histories or a focus on individuals or elements of history, but for anyone who has tried to write about the history of the Bronx from beginning to end, only one of those histories, and there are over 5, has ever been written by a person of color. And even the person of color, Evelyn Gonzalez, who wrote hers, The Bronx, less than 10 years ago, she's not even from here. So my question is, what does it say about the state of society that a group of people, Latinos and African Americans, who have been the dominant population of the Bronx for over 4 decades, that not one of the millions of us has on one side been empowered, or 2, assembled the resources to claim the Bronx from beginning to end in our image? What does that say about our self-image? I'm not saying I know all the answers, but I think it's something we really need to sit with. You live here, for those of you who are local. I live here. We need to claim where we live. And so what we're doing right here, outside of this neo-Tudor building that was built about 100 years ago and has had many uses, is now occupied by the corporate offices of a nonprofit called Community Life, which is all kinds of social services, including housing formerly homeless people elsewhere. This site was also, during the American Revolutionary War, a minor kind of guard gate for the Delancey estate, because the Delanceys were very pro-British. They were not down with the American Revolution. They wanted to keep the colonies colonies. And so they had a blockhouse right here that helped protect their estate, which was very substantial. And some of the ways they protected their estate and that they were able to subsist in a time of war was they stole livestock from other settlers who were fighting for revolution. Some of those armed horseback militiamen were African American. And I learned about that from Anthony C. Green, who is a former education coordinator at the Bronx County Historical Society, who has a master's degree in education. So I just want to hold up this site, because how many of you knew that the term cowboys came from the Bronx? Now you know, and some of them look like me. And with that, we're going to go to River Park. So the reason we're stopping here briefly is there is a street sign across the street. It says Arthur and Dorothy Cryer Place. And I think it's important as you walk by Lambert Houses to know that Phipps Houses, the nonprofit housing developer who developed the Lambert Houses here, they distinguished themselves around World War I for building clean, low-cost, sanitary housing for African-American workers by what is now Lincoln Center. That community was called the Tenderloin. And that was kind of a major African-American settlement before Harlem developed a more African complexion coming through World War I. So that's Phipps Houses. Within Phipps Houses, there's enough history to do its own PowerPoint talk and its own walk. So I can't possibly summarize it, but I will name one person from the Lambert Houses community who's worth knowing, and that is Raheem from Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. So that's one of their vinyls from 1986. And Raheem is right there. So not only did Raheem grow up right in these buildings over here, just to show you the level of humility and the groundedness of this gentleman, he continued to live there even through his stardom and opening up for all kinds of acts all over the world until 2 years ago. and he still lives in the Bronx. He lives further north now, but just wanted to show you that that's one individual who came out of this community, and that's the back cover of their 1980s vinyl showing you the train station just one block away at Crotona Park East, which is the neighborhood that we're going to end this tour in. And I wanted to make a point of holding up this piece of musical history, because one of the ways that we validate working class history is to identify artifacts and material culture from that community. And so this document tells us a lot about society at the time that it was created. So for example, Mel Mel's wearing a beeper on his waist. That's useful information. There are people who are, teenagers today who don't know what a beeper is. So this is a document that can help them understand an earlier iteration in cell phones and smartphones. I also wanted to stop here because we want to acknowledge that early African American history is not just about slavery. In the Dutch colonial period, there were quite a few free Africans, and during the whole Spanish colonial period, many Africans traveled as free people with the conquistadors. And that's important to know. Free African American merchants were some of the earliest inhabitants in terms of people who came through, through Western history. It's North America, including Chicago. First Western inhabitant was a person of African ancestry. First person, dropped at the end of Manhattan Island by those Western forces trying to look for trade routes to Asia was a person of African ancestry. And right here, even in the colonial Bronx, there was a free population. Now, many people have called this being a slave without chains, because yes, you could move around and conduct your own business, but just because of the racism that got encoded into commercial law, your mobility was affected by racist norms. So that, for example, sometimes even free people could not deed land to their children. Sometimes white workmen who were afraid of African competition appealed to make sure that black craftsmen could not work in certain industries, like creating barrels, which was a major, major, major colonial industry, because barrels are how people transported foodstuffs and dry goods during that period. So if you're a black craftsman and the law now says you can't make barrels, that is a major limitation. And the relationship of African craftsmen and foresters to this particular landscape is going to come up as we overlook the falls at about 182nd Street. Let's go. We are at what is now Delancey Falls, or called Delancey Falls, which denotes the former Delancey estate. Very significant. There are at least two places in the Bronx where we know that slavery took a very particular kind of form. Okay, so enslaved Africans did a very wide range of economic functions throughout the colonial period and going right into American independence. What happens in a place like this, which was a plantation right here in the Bronx at a time before the Erie Canal, which wasn't open until the 1820s, grain has to be produced locally because America in the early days doesn't have much infrastructure and roads are limited. So the economical way for New York families to eat is to buy locally grown food. And one of the many places in the region where space is available to grow food is right here on the Bronx River, stretching back toward Morris Park and the Van Ness communities, So a lot of people do not realize that daily, when they're on the Wild Asia monorail in the Bronx Zoo, and when you're taking the 2 and 5 train north from 180th Street, you are zooming through the old slave estate of the Delancey family, as you don't even know. Before the Industrial Revolution, you have people using water power to power a grain mill and a sawmill. So we walk through an urbanized Bronx today, but recognize that back in the 1600s and 1700s, the Bronx was largely wetlands and forests. So if we were standing here in 1800, we would be surrounded by vast oak hickory forests with massive trees that we only have a few of today, which were common then. So many of you here, because I know many of you here, so this is a very sophisticated group, you know about the triangular trade between Africa, the Americas, and Europe in terms of how commodities were circulated and who collected the wealth from that commerce. But there were other trade routes. So within the colonial system, certain locations within certain colonial empires developed ways of sharing resources. So tropical fruit and sugar were abundant in the Caribbean, so those products were imported here. However, here we had oak and hickory timber, which elite communities wanted to create furniture and housing elsewhere. So enslaved Africans, mostly men, were being used here to fell the forests and process the wood, which was being sent to places like St. Kitts and Cuba and elsewhere. And then sugar and tropical fruit were being shipped this way, and rum, and tea, and other things. Shouldn't there be a sign here to interpret that for people? Okay? Less than 0.0000000000001% of the Bronx is on these tours or sees what I do at the library. But everybody needs to know this. This is basic history. We need to understand how the society we live in has developed and how these landscapes have developed. History is not, contained purely behind glass cases in elite buildings, which you mostly pay for, by the way, because all these institutions have their hand out for city, state, and federal money, okay? And since Ronald Reagan, middle class, working class, and poor people pay a higher share of all the funds that go into the public pot, even though we're not being socialized to understand that essential relationship we're playing to hold society up and pay for the roads and the bridges and the schools, etc. But that's the actual state of society in terms of how we pay for stuff. And so this is just the beginning of what I hope we're going to do on this tour. So with that, we're going to celebrate the gentleman who is commemorated with that street sign on the corner by seeing one of the places where he worked and where he created a place for hip-hop culture before the mainstream even knew what hip-hop was in the 70s and 80s. Let's go. Thank you. So I also brought you here, aside from recognizing the Rangers, who just closed their station right there, to show you a building that is beyond Indian Lake right there. So you guys see two towers in the distance, in the near distance, and those are two New York City Housing Authority properties, meaning you all own those buildings. They're public buildings. So those are Murphy houses where some of the earliest hip-hop jams happened in the 1970s and 80s, long before Run DMC, long before national distribution. People were doing hip-hop for real, for local audiences. And it's an important opportunity to recognize why local culture is important. Because it's a historical fact that gangster rap and some of the other things that a lot of us don't have anything to do with did not exist until white-run, transnational multimedia entities bought it out. So when the control was local and authentic, there was a different emotional tone and sound and experience. And so I thought it was very important to acknowledge Murphy Community Center. So let's talk about housing. Let's go. You're welcome to join us. How you doing? From the two last stops that we made, this is the painting of the West Farms Barns, done by Creighton Berry, the philanthropist I told you guys about. He's donated many paintings to the Bronx African American History Project to raise money for the research. And then the other piece of it is, this is an actual flyer for Murphy Houses, one of those early hip hop jams. Again, anyone is welcome to look at all these. Feel free. Yeah. So we seem to all be together now. Hold it together, guys. Hold it together. All will be shown at the last stop. So the reason we're standing here, thank you very much. We're standing here to acknowledge the visionary, the powerful, the brilliant work done by Sister Genevieve Brooks of Mid-Bronx Desperados. So some of you know, some of you may not know, so I'll just share it. So Genevieve Brooks is a lady who, like a lot of Bronx African Americans, grew up in the South, and she came to the Bronx sometime around mid-century, 40s, 50s, and the Bronx at that time was still a pretty amazing place to live in terms of civic dynamism, live music culture, incredible infrastructure, parks, etc. And then World War II happens, America buys into modernism in a big way, we build interstate highways, and we start celebrating as a national culture suburbs. And there's less financial or political support for cities. So the cities start to fall apart in the 60s and 70s. And Miss Genevieve Brooks and others decide they're not going anywhere. So most of you figured it out, but for those who haven't, I'm holding the picture here because right across the street is the image you're seeing this park. So this photograph was taken very near this spot in the 1980s. This photograph comes to us through a catalog of a show that was held at the Bronx Museum of the Arts. Tragically, there's so much more Bronx history available at the Bronx Museum of the Arts than most of us ever see, and it's not their fault, it's a funding problem. They simply don't have the resources to share everything that they have in storage, because it's phenomenal. This is just a hint at what's available there. So what was Mid-Bronx Desperados? So Mid-Bronx Desperados was a housing organization and social services organization because they got involved in daycare. They eventually were very active at rehabilitating parks, including this one. They helped build 3 completely new parks that are in the neighborhood. We're actually going to see 2 of them later on in this tour. And they were formed in the 1970s when very few people outside of the Bronx cared about the future of the Bronx, and where a lot of the buildings were falling apart for all kinds of reasons that would take its own talk and tour to discuss. And she basically had the sensibility that we're going to stay, we're going to rebuild these neighborhoods, my community is important, I am important, this landscape is important, and we're going to rebuild it right here. So they formed this housing group. Another person you're going to learn about is E.J. Mitchell, for whom a park is named, and that's where the tour is going to end. And they did phenomenal work, including building these buildings right here, these private houses, but also rehabilitating existing pre-war apartment buildings, many of which we're going to walk by. We're actually standing here to look at the church. And even though that church wasn't founded by African Americans, it currently houses an African American congregation. And I just thought it was a very important stand-in for a church that no longer exists, of which some people who lived here in West Farms during the American Civil War and shortly thereafter were part of. So right by Parkchester, there was something called Centerville African Methodist Episcopal Church. And the AME churches are very important because they played an essential role in the Underground Railroad. What often happens with American history is, and I'm not necessarily saying that my white brothers mean to do this, but what often happens is white people who are involved in a historical event oftentimes perhaps not knowing, their children or people associated with them will want to commemorate them, and not knowing the other textures and flavors of a story, wind up celebrating the person they knew without understanding the background context. Again, it's not, sometimes completely innocently, just not knowing. So an overwhelming amount of New York State abolition history focuses on Quakers and other white people who used their churches as Underground Railroad sites. And that's worth knowing, and that is valid, and I'm glad they did that, and it was a major sacrifice, and it was a major commitment. I'm not trying to take away from that, but what I'm saying is, one of the backstories of that is African Americans were doing it for themselves long before it was a norm, even for Quakers or Mennonites or other identifiable white groups that still exist. And so the beautiful thing that's happened in the post-civil rights movement is, as African Americans have gained power, I hate to say it, we're losing that power now, but for that golden period between the end of the 60s and the early 80s, when we were coming into historical departments in the region, we were going a little deeper into the history and trying to find out, like, where do we fit into some of this? And what's coming out is a lot of these African Methodist Episcopal churches helped establish some of those roots of the Underground Railroad, again, long before white congregations that were in those vicinities got on board with it. And so these are a photocopy of some of the documents and a map of where the Centerville AME Church was in the Parkchester community. Parkchester didn't exist then, but what is now the Parkchester community. And they were founded around 1855, before the American Civil War. So we want to acknowledge Centerville AME Church, even as we look at this much more recent structure, which now has an African American congregation. We're also here to acknowledge Ma Carter. So Ma Carter is an abbreviation for Juanita Carter. And Miss Juanita Carter lived in the Lambert houses and was one of the many hundreds of people who have lived in this housing development over the last 30 plus years who have worked to make this a more livable place. So when Lambert was first opened, it attracted a lot of the upwardly mobile of the Bronx. And then we know what happened. Angel dust came through this neighborhood, and other drugs, followed by the war on crime, on and on and on and on and on, and a lot of upwardly mobile people who originally inhabited these apartments left for other places. Some of them stayed in the Bronx, moved to the North Bronx. Ma Carter stayed put. And she was part of something called the Tremont Improvement Program, like Mr. Arthur Cryer, whose site we're going to see next. And together, they did all kinds of community festivals. They helped clean up River Park, where we just were. River Park has been renovated at least 3 times in the last 30 years, and it gets all that love because of people like Miss Carter, who insisted on it. So we want to acknowledge Miss Juanita Carter. Thank you, Mama. Okay, so just about everybody's here. The reason we're standing here is, I talked about that street sign earlier. For some of you may know this, but for those of you who do not know, when I call the name of Mr. Arthur Cryer, I'm calling the name of a Calypsonian. I'm calling the name of a gentleman who was deeply steeped in Pan-African music. I'm calling the name of somebody who was deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in the mission of rehabilitating the South Bronx. And he worked for over a decade for something called the Tremont Improvement Program, which was very active in this community during the 1980s and 90s and did a wide range of programs, very, very, very wide range. Everything from stuff for kids to stuff for seniors. And one of the many things they did is, long before this infill housing was built, because these private homes are less than 15 years old, this was a kind of unofficial park. It wasn't a New York City park, but it was an open space. It was, you know, cleared and clean on a basic level, and it was a very common place for local people to come, especially men, to exercise. So this is a workout park, but it was also a reliable place for the Tremont Improvement Program to host local public free music events, okay, when the Bronx was getting itself together. Okay, and so we want to acknowledge both this site and the legacy of those two great individuals, both Mr. Arthur Cryer and Juanita Carter. It happened right here. Okay, so here we are at one of my favorite stops along the whole tour. We're standing across from the West Farms branch of the New York Public Library, and the reason is, that one of the key things that the New York Historical Society shared with the public during their Slavery in New York shows a few years back is that while perhaps most of us were educated to think of slavery in America as a Southern thing, in fact, the economy and politics of New York City in the early 1800s were intimately tied to the slave South, including defenders of slavery and the slave economy. So I'm going to tie it directly into the library in a minute, but I'm going to read what one of those defenders said from the Slavery in New York catalog. Okay, here we go. So, the ascendancy of the Democratic Party with its power, I'm not beating up on the Democratic Party, this is the 1800s. It's just a historical reality. The ascendancy of the Democratic Party with its powerful Southern base shaped New York politics in the half-century prior to the Civil War, leading New York Democrats ranging from Fernando Wood, who recommended, by the way, that New York City secede in order to maintain trade relationships with the slave South in the event of a Southern Confederacy, by the way. That's your Fernando Wood. So he and John Sullivan, August Belmont, and Samuel Tilden, we'll get to Tilden in a minute, were unapologetic in their support of the Southern democracy and its increasing extreme defenses of slavery. New York State Democrats regularly denounced abolitionists while embracing white supremacist policies. Fernando Wood, a rising Democratic politician from the 19th Ward in Upper Manhattan, attacked anti-slavery activists in the 1840s while celebrating the South. Quote, "Where true freedom, chivalry, and honor characterizes the people." August Belmont, a New York financier and the Democratic Party's key fundraiser, maintained close relations with various Southern politicians. So I thought that was an important historical footnote, and it's relevant here because the Samuel Tilden of the then New York Democrats, fortunately his money got turned into something positive, because his will and trust became one of the three big pots of money that together became the New York Public Library. The other reason this site is really worth stopping at is that, again, many streets and place names in the Bronx are directly derived from slave-owning estates and slave-holding families, including Delancey, Ward, Morris, Hunt, Leggett, Ferris. There are others, and Honeywell. So we're on Honeywell Avenue. So we're on a street named after slaveholders with a library, okay, that comes out of an institution partially founded out of the pot of a guy who was an avid defender of slavery. So with that, we're going to walk. Okay, guys, so the reason we're standing here, this is a brief stop, but I think it's a very, 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 very important one. It's very important to me that Bronx River Sankofa be inclusive. So anybody who claims African ancestry is in Bronx River Sankofa. It includes French-speaking, Spanish-speaking, and other speaking people of African descent, including Garifunas. So I didn't know who Garifunas were until fairly recently, but we want to acknowledge this cultural group because the Bronx has their largest population center in North America, and they're a beautiful melange of Carib, Arawak, Indian, also African, and the language they speak has a little bit of Spanish, French, English, Dutch, and Portuguese in it. So it's this great African diasporan community that really has quite a few people living right here in the Bronx and right here in this neighborhood. And in fact, some of the leadership of Crotona Park, where we're going next, are people who are very active with their local pride organization. So I just wanted to acknowledge that part of the way that people like me who just weren't hip to them found out about them was in learning Bronx history. Tragically, a fire that happened in a club where a number of them used to congregate, which was right across the street where the tax service place is, that was a club. And over 80 people perished in a fire that happened there. And so the obelisk that you see in that park is a monument to those people who never should have died but did during the tragedy. So I just wanted to acknowledge Garifunas. This is New York State Garifuna Heritage Month. Chaos. So I try to be very balanced here, and my dad would want me to end on time, so I'm going to honor that. We're making excellent time. And I want to thank all of you who are keeping pace and really keeping it going for that. Could I have two volunteers? I just want to hand out a document. Awesome. Thanks so much. Who else? I need one of the volunteers. So you should all get one of these blue sheets. And what it is a list of Latinos and African Americans. Let me correct this because this is very important. We don't want to offend anybody. This is an introductory list. It does not purport to be comprehensive. It couldn't possibly be. It would have to be a book to be that. But it's an introduction to Latinos and African Americans who have made significant contributions to the rehabilitation of the Bronx River since the 1970s. I just wanted to make sure that it was distributed to the universe because I don't really know that anyone's ever done it for public consumption before. There are biographies of some of the more high-profile people, and I wanted to show you one such place where that exists. So this book groundswell, and I encourage people to shop retail because that's jobs. However, there may just not be a place to find this retail in New York City. This is a book about ecological rehabilitation all over America, and there is a chapter on the Bronx River which captures a few people of color. So I'm very proud of this because this is one of the better references. So we have reached the last stop on our tour, and thanks for being a great audience as Van Jones of Rebuild the Dream and Green for All says, one monkey don't make no show. So, many of you have contributed to my research in direct and indirect ways. Thank you for your contribution. Again, if anyone's interested, please find out more about the Bronx African American History Project. If anyone has any questions, ask me at the end. Again, there's a Facebook page where you can learn more. Bronx River Sankofa. Thank you for your attention.